my name is Alice Moseley, and I'm going to be chairing the next session. So I am one of the co-investigators on Renew, and I work on the second theme, communities. I'm an associate professor of politics, so I'm going to simply open this session, which is on domains of environmental justice. And in this session, we're going to hear from 3 of the Renew academics that are leading different elements of our programme. And I'm going to introduce each speaker quickly now, and each person will talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A for about 15 minutes. So this whole session will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a break after that. So I'd like to, first of all, the first speaker will be Catriona McKinnon, who you've already met this morning, and she is going to discuss theories of environmental justice and reflecting her work as a theorist, a political theorist and a political philosopher. And she is one of the directors of Renew and leading Theme 2, Community Action. Hi, Catriona. And secondly, we'll have Charlie Masquelier, who is working on Theme 3, Land Managers. Hello, Charlie. And Charlie's a social theorist and an environmental sociologist, working on issues of social empowerment. He's going to be discussing some of the work that Theme 3 have been undertaking, connected to land management. And then finally, we've got Ben Groom. Welcome, Ben, who will be talking from his Theme 4, which is business and financial decision making. And his talk will be called Distribution Over Time and Distribution in Space, a welfarist view of decision making in nature and climate. So welcome to all of the speakers, and I'll pass on to Catriona now.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Alice. I am going to share my screen. I am a political philosopher, and I thought it would be useful for you to have a and it will be a quick overview of how political philosophers think about and have thought about environmental justice. So the question of what justice is writ large it has been a concern to political philosophers since at least Plato, and they've had much to say as well about environmental justice. So I'm going to move really quickly and give you this whistle-stop tour of different ways of thinking from within my discipline about environmental justice. And just as another sort of coda, these approaches are not necessarily in competition. Very often they're in conversation with one another, and they emerge and develop as a result of that conversation. Okay, so the first approach I want to talk about is thinking about environmental justice as distributive justice. And this will probably be one of the most familiar ways to think about environmental justice. So broadly speaking, distributive justice is justice in the distribution of stuff in society by political authorities. So how ought we to share out in ways that are fair the benefits and burdens of our social cooperation in political society is the core question of distributive justice. Thinking of environmental justice in this way starts with the thought that the natural environment is as important in that bundle of goods as political goods such as liberty, opportunity, and income and wealth, and thus that political authorities ought to distribute and think about distributing the natural environment and access to it fairly across all people in exactly the same way that they do with respect to other political goods. So the kind of payoff from this way of thinking would be, for example, thinking about access to natural spaces as something to be distributed fairly. So questions of access get asked under this rubric. And also, sort of more fundamentally, I think this approach enables you to think about the renewal of nature as not just a nice to have, but as fundamental a question of justice as the question of how we ought to distribute liberty across all people or political opportunity. So moving on. A different approach focuses on the procedures by which we make decisions about how we treat the natural environment. So the thought here is that environmental justice demands more than just a focus on outcomes to be achieved. It also requires a focus on the procedures by which political decisions are made, and importantly, the exercises of power embodied in those procedures. And so the focus here is on recognition of cultural difference and different cultural values, voice, representation, non-domination, transparency and accountability in political decision-making about the environment. Some of the payoffs of this approach, I think, are evident in the focus on environmental citizens' assemblies to represent the interests of all people in protecting nature, and also the call to take seriously Indigenous knowledge as expert knowledge when we are making political decisions about environmental questions. Another approach, very influential, is to think about environmental justice as ecofeminism. And so the animating first thought here is that frameworks of justice often appeal to impartiality and to the separateness of persons, human beings, from nature and from one another. And I think some of Ashanti's words were really spoke in a powerful way to this. Ecofeminists have reminded us that these frameworks have a history in patriarchy, which is a system of power and represents an abuse of power. So an alternative lens for thinking about justice and fairness and the environment that is offered by feminism is a lens of care and connectedness. So the thought here is that we should use this lens to think about our interpersonal relations and also the relationships that we have with the non-human world. And feminists have argued that this has radical potential to supplant patriarchal frames, and these frames are one of the main drivers of our environmental crises. Some of the payoffs from this approach, and these are just examples. So a requirement to take very seriously the well-evidenced gendered impact of environmental crises and to tailor solutions to the crises in a way that take account of those gendered impacts, and to recognize environmental injustice as intersectional. So feminism, ecofeminism focuses, one of its main focuses is on inequalities of power. And ecofeminists have pointed out quite rightly that there are multiple dimensions of powerlessness that amplify environmental injustice, and that this has to be part of our core thinking about how to address that form of injustice. Environmental justice is eco-socialism. So the animating view here is, put bluntly, that justice for people and planet requires dismantling global capitalism and abolishing class privilege, that this economic system is the driver, one of the main drivers at least, of our multiple environmental crises. Now, there have been there's been quite a lot of academic work recently which tries to rehabilitate a Marxist approach to thinking about socialism into environmentalism by arguing that the growth imperative that is clearly inherent in capitalism, but also inherent in traditional Marxism, that growth imperative is not necessary for the political program of socialism, so that eco-socialism, inspired by the Marxist tradition, is not necessarily an oxymoron. So there's a really interesting kind of upwelling in socialist and Marxist scholarship recently, which tries to make that case and to decouple socialism and Marxist-inspired socialism from the growth imperative. Some implications of this: it's a radical view, planned economic degrowth as a route out of our multiple environmental crises. And in terms of a focus on action, there's a real sort of grassroots focus on movement building among oppressed people globally to cultivate consciousness, class eco-consciousness. So there are many sort of manifestos which have been brought together by coalitions of movements which aim to speak to the concerns of oppressed peoples that are part of this kind of movement building effort. Next, environmental justice as what's being called in the literature right now, multi-species justice. Now, I think this view actually is speaking to quite a well-established set of concerns in philosophy, which relate to the value of non-human life. And so the animating first thought here is that humans are not the only living things deserving of moral and ethical consideration, and humans are not separate from nor more important from non-human nature. Views that have it that human beings are indeed special or at the top of the tree of value are known as anthropocentric views. And multi-species justice approaches say that that anthropocentrism in politics is an unjustified product of the historical exercise of human power over nature, and that this is where we need to press if we want to address environmental injustice. Some of the implications of this view, the rights of nature movement, which is making great strides, particularly in South American countries. We are doing some work elsewhere in Renew on this particular movement. And there are some very interesting, quite radical proposals around about how to achieve democratic deliberation that speaks to an interspecies concern using creative practice and all sorts of really innovative methods. I'll just finish with the last one, and this is my particular specialism. So I work on intergenerational justice in the context of multiple environmental crises. And the view here is that our global environmental crises are fundamentally intergenerational. So time's arrow moves in only one direction, and that means that future people are entirely vulnerable to the choices of people in the present. And the choices that we make to damage, trash, overuse, exploit the environment, the costs of those choices will be felt disproportionately by people who will come after us, potentially into the far future. Once you combine that thought with a recognition that there is a standing temptation for any generation in time to pass the buck of dealing with environmental crises onto unborn future people, then we face a potentially very serious situation for those who will come after us. So some implications of this. So just to plug a book that I'm writing, which defends a new international crime that I call postericide, which involves putting future people at risk of extinction. Also, there is a very interesting project around developing a global constitutional convention for future generations, which is being undertaken by a philosopher called Steve Gardner. So thanks for listening. I'll hand back to Alice now.
Thank you very much, Catriona. Perfectly timed. That was a fascinating kind of whistle-stop tour of some really key theoretical dimensions that we should think about as we go through this session, and I'm sure we'll come back to those in the next discussions. So Charlie, I'm going to hand over to you now, please, for your.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully.
Great. And while you're sharing your screen, just to remind people, you may have seen on the chat, if you want to post questions on the Q&A while the speakers are presenting, please feel free to do that, and then we can pick up on those afterwards. So there's a little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen that will allow you to post questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you, everyone. So here I intend to show how much of the social science work we have been doing for theme 3, the land managers theme, speaks to the theme of environmental justice. The data collected for this work has been predominantly qualitative. This allowed us to collect rich and detailed data about the way land managers engage with nature recovery and understand how land managers make sense of nature recovery itself, what meanings they might assign to nature recovery actions, to relations with conservation groups, etc. This makes it possible for the researcher, i.e. us, to understand what the world looks like from the perspective of participants, which is crucial for grasping what the barriers to nature recovery are and how they affect land managers. This work of empathetic understanding, central to the discipline of sociology, brought the experience of environmental injustice into sharp relief among the participants. In what follows, I explain how this is manifested in their responses and what implications environmental injustice has for environmental land management. Let me start with a fact that is often highlighted. Around 70% of the land in England is farmed. Farmers are therefore key stakeholders in environmental land management. This explains why much attention has been paid to incentivizing their participation in nature recovery through measures like agri-environment schemes. But research suggests that financial incentives are limited in their capacity to foster long-term behavior change among farmers. For example, Marison Potter put it, incentives are often experienced as temporary bribes, shallow in operation, and transitory in their effect. What is more, the financial sustainability and effectiveness of schemes have been questioned. How then could their effectiveness be improved? Many studies suggest that high-quality engagement in nature recovery depends on ensuring that land managers develop a sense of responsibility and ownership of actions taken to renew nature. A particularly strong theme arising from our Theme 3 research through the Bok Talk work, but especially the interviews which I'm going to talk about today, is the sense that existing schemes and environmental land management practices are still a long way away from fostering this sense of responsibility and ownership. According to many participants in our research, environmental land management does not sufficiently account for the voice and knowledge of land managers. This is a concern for them, including those already active in nature recovery. Such a concern, I argue here, is best construed as an issue of environmental injustice. But what do I mean by environmental injustice? There are many ways to define it, and we saw with Catriona's talk some of the ways to define it, and there are many different forms of environmental injustice. Particularly relevant to the way land managers speak of their experiences is the definition offered by the US Environmental Protection Agency. Here's what it says, and it's on the slide there. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. What I want to place a particular emphasis on here is the notion of fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people. The sense that land managers, particularly what they know, are not meaningfully involved in environmental land management is a particularly strong theme arising from our research, the interviews. Take, for example, the following quotation from an arable farmer in Norfolk. They need to remember we're living in it, amongst it, and we're seeing it every day. All through the year, the changes of seasons, no one knows our land better than the people farming or managing it. This passage, which captures how several of our participants feel about the way they're involved, or should I say, not involved in environmental land management, places a strong emphasis on what farmers know and the fact that this knowledge is not sufficiently accounted for in decision-making around nature recovery. It also reflects a demand that chimes with much of the literature on this issue, like the knowledge cultures scholarship, which suggests that effective engagement in nature recovery is best achieved through the integration of scientific knowledge with the local knowledge of land managers. There is another way. Fair treatment and meaningful involvement remains limited, according to many of our participants. This has to do with a perceived incapacity for schemes, agri-environment schemes, and prescriptions to be adequately adapted to land conditions and configurations. Take, for example, this farmer from Devon with a very strong environmental record. One of the reasons we didn't do any of the SFIs is because, like the scrubland option, which would have been brilliant because we have a lot of that, was prescriptive of the grazing. So scrubland creation, you weren't allowed to graze it for 5 years. It's supposed to be a mosaic scrubland. You literally can't do it. Had to get hold of them and tell them this, and it was like, you literally can't. You are making it to fail. You will not get a mosaic. This is insane. None of this is going to work. The inflexible character of environmental prescriptions was the second most cited barrier to engagement expressed by participants in our research. We found many references to what they regard as a blanket or one-size-fits-all approach to nature recovery. These were complemented, those references, by demands for drawing on local knowledge to make environmental prescriptions work more effectively. The lack of flexibility or adaptability of environmental prescriptions is ultimately construed as a problem of unfair treatment and exclusion from meaningful involvement in decision-making around environmental prescriptions, and what that, in their view, undermines the effectiveness of nature recovery practices. But many land managers also feel threatened by efforts to recover nature. They feel that the way environmental land management currently operates interferes with farming instead of being made compatible with it. Here, the sense of injustice is not so much said to derive from a sense of exclusion from decision-making as a perceived misalignment between nature recovery priorities and farming. As one of our participants put it, we seem to be left behind, especially around here, you know. We're going to rewild everywhere. You're thinking, well, what about me and what about my living? What about my community and what about this? Well, yes, that does come into it. Well, we have got an objective here. We've got to get 10% of the country in wildings, and I'm afraid it's you. And you are thinking, well, that is not what it is. Here, the sense of injustice stems from a perceived encroachment of nature recovery actions over both the business and culture of farming. And that results from the problem of exclusion from decision-making in environmental land management. It therefore corresponds to an experience of environmental injustice. What then is useful about interpreting those issues as matters of environmental injustice? Is it just an academic exercise? Well, I beg to differ. I want to show that there are 6 key takeaways that could help design more effective environmental programs. First, looking at it from an environmental justice lens allows us to recognize that there's a strong appetite for meaningful involvement in decision-making around nature recovery. It directs attention towards issues, that's the second one, of power, both between farmers and conservation organizations, and between farming knowledge and conservation science. 1 minute, yeah? Third, in doing the above, it allows us to understand that fostering a sense of responsibility and ownership over actions taken to recover nature starts with ensuring that environmental land management decisions are perceived as just or fair. Fourth, it tells us that to achieve environmental justice, land managers must be in a position to play an active role in decision-making around nature recovery and be given opportunities to choose how to align the nature recovery priorities with their farming counterpart. For example, to turn grazing into a conservation practice rather than excluding grazing from environmental land management. Fifth, it directs attention towards the fact that land managers feel they are not treated as knowers in their own right, that they do not feel they have the authority to speak, as it were. The injustice they experience is thus at once environmental and epistemic. And finally, it follows that while financial incentives are necessary, they're not sufficient. Combining them with genuine opportunities for knowledge integration is key. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Perfect. Really interesting to hear about what environmental justice might mean for this very important constituency that are stewarding the land and farming. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to pass over to Ben Groom now to give us an economist's perspective on some of these issues. And just as a reminder, please do put your questions in the Q&A as Ben is speaking, if anything occurs to you as you're listening. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the invitation. Very nice to be here. Very interesting presentations thus far. What I want to do now is talk about how economists think about intergenerational fairness in the analysis of projects which have intergenerational consequences like climate change or biodiversity conservation. We are now in a very squarely utilitarian world. That is our ethical structure here. And I want to tell you something about how economists use this structure to evaluate projects with costs and benefits which have really intergenerational consequences. So this is how it's going to go. I'm going to tell you about the simple Ramsey rule, which you'll find in the Treasury Green Book, and then all the possible extensions, which include things like risk and disaster and inequality and environmental aspects as well, and how economists have handled all of those different aspects. So here's the essential problem that economists look at. This is the costs in red and the benefits in blue of meeting 2-degree limiting climate change to 2 degrees centigrade, according to an integrated assessment model. What you see here, of course, is for like almost 100 years, costs to society, with the benefits occurring in the future from reduced temperatures and such like, avoided climate damages, basically. So economists need a way. This is in the tradition of cost-benefit analysis, to say, okay, look, are these costs worth the benefits in some way? And that is the brutal calculus that actually Ashanti was talking about in her poem as well, that we're stuck with here. And these are just the benefits written as in numerical terms as they occur at the time. But what if you start discounting the future, putting different weights on different on the future generations than you would on the present, then this calculation looks very different. So if you put just a 2% discount rate on these costs and benefits, this is what the relative costs and benefits look like. If you put a 5% discount rate on it, you're certainly not going to do this investment because the benefits do not outweigh the costs in the present. Okay. So the discount rate can be thought of as the opposite of your interest rate. You know, you can think about putting £10 in the bank at 5% in 30 years' time. That'll be worth about £40. What that means, discounting is the reverse process of that. If you have £40 arriving in 30 years' time, that's only worth £10 today. That's the basic idea. Okay. So how do we look at this particular problem from a utilitarian perspective in economics? And what it's really important to understand before we go into this horrible calculus that economists do is the general view that is captured in utilitarianism, that if we have all things equal, if we have a rich person and a poor person, we would much prefer to give an extra pound to the poor person than to the rich person. This sense of inequality aversion is captured in economics with diminishing marginal utility. The utility that we get from an extra pound is much lower if we're rich compared to whether we're poor. So what utilitarianism does is embed this inequality aversion into the analysis of costs and benefits. Now, what we're doing in intergenerational context then is thinking about rich versus poor over time rather than in society today. Okay, so that's all that is going to happen now. So how do economists think about this? Well, this equation here, deep breath, everybody, is essentially how gives you, you might think, why do we want to discount the future? Well, here is the ethical perspective on why we might want to do that. The discount rate R, higher discount rate, lower weight on future generations. Why would we do that? Firstly, this letter rho, this would be to do with impatience, or it could be to do with catastrophic risk. You know, we might not want to invest in something today if none of us are around in 50 years' time. The second part is the intergenerational inequality aspect, right? It's called the wealth effect. And what this basically says is that if future generations are much richer than us, and that's the EG, that's our expected growth in incomes, and we're inequality averse, that's the Greek letter eta there, then we might put less weight on their benefits and costs than we do for people today, i.e., today is the poor generation, future is the rich generation, right? So we will put less weight on the extra units towards them, okay?
That's 5 minutes, Ben, thanks.
Thank you. So that is the kind of ethical structure for discounting the future, because it's really purely coming from inequality aversion, right? Now, we might question whether or not we know what growth in the future is going to be. And if we're very uncertain about that, then typically economists would reduce the discount rate. You know, we don't know what growth is going to be. We could be poor, we could be rich. We tend to put more weight on the states of the world in which we're poor. So we would reduce the discount rate with this term here, which reflects the variance in G growth, etc. Okay, so we might reduce the discount rate if we're uncertain about the future and so on. If we think there's, I'm going to skip this slide actually. No, I'm not. So if you think this variation in growth as we look into the future is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, then we might use a declining discount rate, one that gets lower as we look further and further into the future. Why? Because this prudence effect, this effect of the likelihood of being poor in the future is growing and growing, and we put more weight on benefits arriving in the future. Again, if we think there are going to be disasters, rare disasters happening in the future, this could be climate related, it could be to do with just recessions like the great financial crisis 2008, something like that. Again, this gives us a lower discount rate. So we're putting more weight on the future because we think there's a higher probability of people being poorer in the future. Last point, last 2 points here. Again, if we thinking about not intergenerational but intragenerational inequality, if we look into society today, we see income is unfairly distributed, and we think as time goes by in the future, this is going to become even more unequally distributed. Then we put even more weight on future generations because in effect, they're not as rich as in welfare terms as we would have expected, because now there's more unfairness in society. So this gives us another inequality, intragenerational inequality adjustment to the weight that we put on future generations. Finally, we might think about the environment. Now, this is a term here which basically looks at growth in consumption, the things and goods and services that we consume, and growth in environment, the scarcity of environmental goods and services, the environment writ large, biodiversity, etc. Now, if we think that growth in environmental goods and services is less than the growth in consumption in other goods and services, normal goods and services, then that means that the environment is becoming relatively more scarce, and we're going to put much higher value on that. And so that translates into a lower discount rate and higher valuations in the future. So these terms here, which look complicated, but hopefully I've described them well enough, tell us something about how in this utilitarian framework we can think through the different states of the world in the future and make this balance between current and future generations' well-being. Now, it's a brutal calculus, obviously, and this is, economists don't shy away from this. In terms of the environmental discount component, this is really coming from a paper that we did in Science, where this basically shows the effect of having that environmental component. That means that the prices that we apply to environmental cost-benefit analysis increase as we look into the future, just to reflect the fact of this relative scarcity. And of course, if there's non-substitutability, that price gets higher and higher. So we're really thinking about both ethical aspects, but also the fundamentals that determine the state of the world in the future. Here's a summary table of all of this. Is it 1 minute? Yeah, here's a summary table of all of these different things. So there's different aspects of the state of the future world that we need to take into account. Risk in terms of growth, rare disasters, inequality, environment, etc. These help us come to a position on future generational, intergenerational fairness. But do these things happen anywhere? This is fairly arcane stuff. Well, the answer is yes. So in the UK, since 2003, we've used declining discount rates to account for this future risk problem. The US does the same. The Netherlands does DDR, declining discount rates as well, and has an environmental correction, as does France. All of the Nordics have declining discount rates to think about future generational fairness. New Zealand has recently changed its guidance on these things, and so on. Question mark about finance here. And just by the way, this title of this slide is the map of thoughts of fairness to policy. I thought that was a really nice. I'm sort of paraphrasing. I couldn't remember exactly how it was put, but Ashanti basically mentioned this mapping of our thoughts into policy and such like. So this really arcane theory embedded in a utilitarian framework has actually led to many different policy changes in government guidance, how governments think about how to evaluate their investments and regulatory changes and future generations, basically. Does this happen in finance? No, it doesn't. The objectives of finance are not social welfare, utility, but they are to do with making money. And so their discount rate has nothing really to do with these ethical aspects that we've described here. And that, I think, is at the bottom of many of the distorted allocations of capital that we see in the financial sector. Thank you very much. I hope that wasn't too, it was quite a departure from poetry, but I hope that was kind of clear at least.
Thanks, Ben. It was really nice to have an invitation to take a deep breath, but for a very different reason. So I did need to do that to digest that. Thank you very much. And what's great about these three presentations is it illustrates the diversity of Renew and coming at it from different disciplinary perspectives, but sharing a kind of common vocabulary in terms of the concepts and theories that we're all interested in. So I'm going to read out a couple of questions. We've got a group of questions for Ben, and I've got a group for Charlie, and I think Catriona also please pitch in as and when, and people can feel free to put more questions as we go. So there's a couple, I'll read yours out, Ben, first as a group. That might make sense since you've just spoken. So the first question is from who asks, does environmental justice require us to move away from utilitarian anthropocentric worldview in economics? Now, of course, others can pitch into this question too. I think, Ben, you might be best placed to start with that. And I've just had a question by text as well, by someone else, which is quite similar, asking the question, discounting at any positive value means that eventually damage to future people counts for nothing. Is this ethically acceptable? So maybe you could address those two questions.
Well, so it would be really from my perspective, quite coincidental that the discount rate would be zero. I mean, that you know, if you just don't discount, you're actually discounting at the rate of zero. Now, from this sort of perspective that I've shown you here, that would be quite coincidental. Much of the discussion here has been on zero discounting, certainly with regard to the Stern review, climate change, etc., was to do with the first component on impatience and basically the utility discount rate, and not the inequality aversion part, right? So the logic of discounting just comes from inequality aversion, right? If you think that somebody is richer in the future, you don't value the benefits to them as much as you do a poor person. That's the kind of brutal logic of that. I don't think it's unethical to have a positive discount rate, right? Because you know, if it was certainly within this framework, if you have a zero discount rate on utility, what that means is that we care the same for my daughter's well-being tomorrow as I do for somebody who exists in 1 million years' time, right? Now, there's a whole tradition as Catriona will probably tell, there's a whole tradition in utilitarianism, Frank Ramsey, etc., who's behind the Ramsey rule, who suggests that is fine. But there's also, it's not the only ethical story in town, because one argument is that whilst positive discounting in this framework somewhat tyrannizes the future, zero discounting actually tyrannizes the present in terms of what we have to do. And there's a whole bunch of different ethical perspectives in terms of agent relative ethics and such like, which would completely disagree with zero discounting. So it's a complicated story, right? But what the work I'm doing here and what all my colleagues are doing is just trying to get that balance right. That's all. Yeah. Thanks very
much. There's a question, just one further question related to that, which I'll read out, and then we'll move over to Charlie's questions. It's you may be able to see it yourself, Ben, on the Q&A. The question is the utilitarian framework and trying to boil the environment down to a mathematical calculation or a financial value part of the problem? And they're referring to Ashanti's opening and some of the other panelists' comments. So they're questioning, where should emotion and connection come in? And does this way of looking at it perpetuate the mistaken idea that we are separate to the environment? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't, I mean, So that's a very big question, right? And so how am I going to answer that? I think I'm going to say the following: is that I'm not going to necessarily disagree with that perspective, right? But what I am going to do is answer why I am doing this, if I believe that. And I find that the framework here is extremely helpful in organizing ideas. As you can see, you think, okay, how are we going to handle the fact that inequality today is important as well as inequality over time, right? Okay, so now I have a framework. I've told you some of the answers here. If you're willing to accept this utilitarian framework, it tells you some answers. If things are more unequal in the future, then I'm going to put more weight on the future, basically. Now, that doesn't seem bad to me as an outcome in terms of thinking through the ethics, but does it solve all problems in terms of us being separate from nature and all of that sort of thing? No, it doesn't.
Thank you, Ben. Well answered, a very difficult question. Catriona, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just to quickly pitch in on this. So just from the point of view of sort of philosophical ethics and I think there's a real pushback against ethical business as usual. Right, so I think there is a powerful thought in the literature that actually the sort of utilitarian framework within which economics is done isn't value neutral, right? And Ben made that very clear. But that the values it has embedded in it are not serving people and nature together, right? So that maybe we actually need to sort of fundamentally shift the values at the heart of our thinking in a way that take us away from that sort of ethical business as usual. And I think some of Ashanti's words were speaking directly to that. I think there are really powerful arguments to be taken really seriously about the urgency of our environmental crises and being pragmatic actually about the frameworks within which we operate. But that fundamental pushback against ethical business as usual, I think, is really powerful.
Thanks, Catriona. I think we'd better move on to some questions for Charlie now, but linking from that previous question about emotions. So there's a question here about how farmers experience subsidies and incentives and so forth. And the question is, how important is the emotional connection here? And could farmers' knowledge be thought of as indigenous knowledge? Or are farmers too much part of the industrialization of nature for us to think in this way?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, there's certainly an emotional connection for sure. You could say there's a utilitarian connection too, of course, because that ethos very much mediates a lot of the way farmers actually, relate to nature. You can't really discount that. But and then there's a cultural dimension that's really, really quite strong as well. The identity of farmers as sheep farmers, for example, that aren't sheep farmers because they want to make a lot of money. Yet they really do think about money in a lot of the actions that they have to take because it's a matter of survival for them as sheep farmers, to have money or not, to be able to, survive every year. So they are businessmen in many ways, but they are also farmers with an identity, with a culture. Now, the comparison with indigenous knowledge, I think, is totally fair. There is certainly, very much a lot of the farmers that, are operating in England very much have been operating in the area for quite some time, right? Across generations, and those that develop a particularly strong sense of identity as farmers often. There is a difference, though, potentially here, because obviously they are farmers in the global north. So the practices and the particular worldviews and the utilitarian ethos all are very much part of, the equation of the way they manage the land. And often when we think about indigenous knowledge, we're thinking, about a knowledge that would in some ways oppose those particular forms of thinking. So in many ways, they are quite different. But there are very strong similarities. I mean, I read a text called Monocultures of the Mind by Vandana Shiva. I don't know if he has read it. It's a brilliant text, and she talks a lot about farmers in the Global South. And one thing that was particularly striking was how farmers in the Global South, resisted and wanted to resist the way, the Global North came with their scientific knowledge and decided these were the problems and these were the solutions to solve the problems. And they resisted that quite enormously because they had other ways of doing it. And I think in many ways, I mean, there are very strong signs, very strong parallels with what's going on in England. And I do think that farmers may not always have environmental knowledge or ecological knowledge, conservation knowledge, but they have the knowledge of the land. And this is something that's really quite key. And this is for me, not capitalizing on that is crazy. And I think more effort should be done to capitalize on that knowledge. Sorry, rant over. I know we've out of time.
Thanks.
I apologize.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. We've only got a minute left, but there's a couple of questions I will just read out. I don't think you'll have a chance to answer them here, but maybe you can in the Q&A. You can type a response, Charlie, or any of the panelists. One of the questions was around the pressure on farming businesses. This has actually come to me via text. Over 6,000 farming businesses have been forced to close due to change in government policy, and the Environment Agency are closing down farms overnight. How do these stressors contribute towards tensions when we're considering nature recovery priorities amongst land managers? And so the role of policy and the stress that causes, and how we then think about the role as in terms of nature recovery and land management. And then a second question here, which is about ownership of land. Ownership and accountability of and around one's actions are important, but ownership of land feels problematic for environmental justice. How can access to that 70% of land in the UK which is farmed be facilitated for those who do not and cannot own land without simply a financial incentivization? So big questions, and unfortunately there's no time to answer those now, but please, if any of the panelists have thoughts on those, do add those to the queue in the answers, and people will be able to see those. So thank you very much, all our panelists, and thank you everyone for listening and for your excellent questions. That was beginning to be a really, really interesting debate, and I'm only sorry that we had to cut it short.